Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is July 20th. On this night in 2012, what should have been a fun, ordinary trip to the movies became a nightmare that shook the nation. In Aurora, Colorado, fans lined up for the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises, excited to see the final installment of the beloved superhero trilogy. But that excitement turned to chaos when a gunman opened fire inside of the theater. By the end of the attack, 12 people were dead, 70 more were injured. And a quiet suburban town had become the epicenter of one of the most devastating mass shootings in U.S. history. Today, we're revisiting that tragic night in Aurora, looking at how it unfolded, who was responsible, and the long, painful aftermath that followed. Let's get started. It was just past midnight when more than 400 moviegoers settled into their seats at the Century 16 Theater in Aurora, Colorado, outside of Denver. It was a typical summer night, and the excitement in the air was palpable. People dressed up, some in costume, to celebrate the release of The Dark Knight Rises. There were kids, couples on dates, families, and groups of friends. Among them was 24-year-old James Holmes. He bought a ticket, just like everyone else, and walked into Theater 9. There, he sat quietly for about 20 minutes. But then he left through a side exit. Unbeknownst to anyone inside, Holmes went to his car, suited up in head-to-toe body armor, and armed himself with multiple weapons. Minutes later, he returned through that same door, this time carrying a semi-automatic rifle, a shotgun, and a handgun. He also brought in tear gas canisters. Then he opened fire. The theater went from festive to frantic in an instant. Holmes threw 2 gas canisters into the crowd, filling the air with smoke. As people coughed and struggled to see, he raised his weapons and began shooting. At first, some people didn't know what was going on. They thought it was part of the movie. But the screams, the blood, and the panic quickly shattered that illusion. Within minutes, the shooting had claimed 12 lives. Among them, 6-year-old Veronica Moser Sullivan, the youngest victim. 70 others were injured, some gravely. Holmes fired over 70 rounds before walking out of the theater. He was arrested near his car without a fight, still wearing full tactical gear. When officers asked who he was, he allegedly told them, "I'm the Joker," though the prosecutor in his case later denied this. Police would later discover that Holmes had rigged his apartment with elaborate explosives, which took bomb squads hours to safely dismantle. To many, James Holmes didn't fit the profile of a mass murderer. He had grown up in California and was the son of an engineer and a nurse. He was described as quiet and intelligent. He graduated with honors from the University of California, Riverside, and had recently been a doctoral student in neuroscience at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus. But behind the academic achievements, something darker was unraveling. Holmes had dropped out of his PhD program shortly before the shooting. He'd also been seeing a university psychiatrist, Dr. Lynn Fenton, who had raised red flags about his mental health. She had noted signs of delusion, withdrawal, and homicidal thoughts. But Holmes never told her the specifics, so there was little that could legally be done to stop him. Despite his mental health struggles, Holmes managed to stockpile weapons and ammunition over several months. All legally. News of the attack spread rapidly. President Obama addressed the nation just hours later, calling it a, quote, tragedy of unspeakable proportions, end quote. He and the First Lady traveled to Aurora, sitting with victims and their families, offering comfort in the face of their overwhelming grief. In the days that followed, stories of incredible bravery began to emerge. Young men who shielded their girlfriends with their bodies, strangers who helped carry the wounded to safety, first responders who waded into the chaos to save lives. In its darkest hour, Aurora came together. Candlelight vigils lit up city parks, and memorials sprang up outside of the theater. And across the country, the shooting reignited fierce debates about gun laws and mental health care. In total, James Holmes ended up facing 166 charges, including multiple counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder. His defense team admitted that he was the gunman, but argued that he was legally insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, one of premeditation. They pointed to the elaborate booby traps in his apartment, the months of weapons purchases, and his journal entries that detailed plans for mass murder. His trial began in April 2015 and stretched into the summer. Survivors and victims' loved ones testified in heartbreaking detail. Jurors were shown graphic photos. They heard 911 calls. They relived the horror of that night. On July 16, 2015, almost 3 years to the day of the shooting, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all charges. When it came time to decide his fate, the jury could not unanimously agree on the death penalty. Instead, Holmes was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus over 3,000 additional years for the attempted murders and explosive charges. He remains incarcerated in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. The Aurora shooting remains one of the most notorious mass shootings in American history. At the time, it was the deadliest in Colorado since Columbine. In its aftermath, lawmakers in Colorado passed new gun control measures, including expanded background checks and limits on high-capacity magazines. The laws were controversial and sparked protests, but they signaled a shift in the political landscape. Nationally, the tragedy spurred conversations about how mental health issues are handled and whether current systems do enough to identify and intervene in dangerous situations. The Century 16 Theater reopened in January 2013. Theater 9 was completely renovated and renamed. Survivors and victims' families were invited to visit ahead of the reopening. Some did, others chose not to. The Aurora Theater shooting was another in a long line of mass shootings in America and marked one more location, a movie theater, where it became clear we are not safe. But beyond the headlines and the horror, there were people. There were lives that were full of promise, and there were families who were left with empty seats, and a community that was forever changed. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!